welcome to 3DRT, Alex here. Today I'm going to post a bit of a rant now, so first of all, this video will sound a bit negative overall, as I'm mostly showing all the issues I had in the past 2 months with my Prusa. I'd still recommend the printer in a heartbeat. It's a great machine, but I'm left a bit sour currently with the amount of issues I seem to amass that come down to quality issues of parts. But overall, comparing to other printers I have and had, this is still to be considered quite okay, and between the issues, the print quality is really extraordinarily good for the price point of this machine. Also, I do tinker a lot, so some of these might not have shown up if I wouldn't have made modifications to the printer, but I'll come back to that later when it comes to those issues. My first issue was even before powering up the printer. I had a missing part. Nothing crucial, just the knob for the LCD display, so I sort of took this as a challenge and printed this as my first part. In the end, the printer's quite usable without the knob anyway, but it still looks a bit off now with the silver button. Another thing I sort of did notice immediately was how thoroughly some of the parts looked. The print quality was okay overall. I guess to move on with production you have to make some sacrifices, and at the time I was quite happy with that, as form follows functions, and getting the printers out of the door meant a lot to me, as I wouldn't have gotten my printer that early if the parts would have taken much longer to print. So as long as everything was stable, I guess this was okay, but I'll come back to that later too. After finishing the build, the first frustration set in when trying to calibrate the printer with perpendicular axis. It just wouldn't work. Everything measured perfectly. I used the laser scope and calipers to measure, and everything basically told me everything was 90 degrees, so I actually gave up on this after a while. One of the first prints I was sort of looking for even before the printer arrived was a bow from World of Warcraft at the time. I was tinkering with that a while already. My old printer had a too small print bed, and overall quality was going to be much better with the Prusa. And I faced a lot of issues with getting one edge of the print to stick. Actually not really the edge, rather a sort of roundish area a bit further in. I checked the screws, tried to compensate with calibration, but overall there was no way to get it to stick. There was an obvious dent in the print bed showing up very clearly against the light source. So I taped it up with Kapton tape to make the area usable and message support. I got a new print bed, installed that, and off we go, prints perfectly again. Also, without changing anything else except the print bed, the printer now calibrated as perpendicular. So I guess the dent probably affected that calibration too. Then, after just a few hours of printing, I noticed a lot of black dust collecting on the X-axis carriage. The belt was rubbing against something, so I loosened tension of it by one tooth and it stopped. This was just a minor annoyance, but I closely followed the manual for putting tension on the belt, and this shouldn't have happened, I guess. Next up, the X-axis was a bit loud to begin with, and it worked its way up to a screeching sound over the first few days, until I noticed a big scratch on the smooth rod. One of the bearings was binding, and I disassembled the printer, and yes, the bearing is totally busted. It took massive force to move the smooth rod through it compared to all the other bearings, but actually I was already planning on upgrading to Aegis bearings anyway, so I just swapped them out everywhere. And that was when a world of pain started to drop down on me. Suddenly no print would really work out. I would get very unclear print results. X and Y axis were really smooth at this time, but C had troubles with the lift on travel moves and sometimes would lose a step there. Turns out the X-axis carriage, Z-axis parts are not as straight as they should be for Aegis bearings to work next to each other. So I swapped one of the Aegis back out and placed the ball bearing back in there, as they have greater tolerances. And everything was back to perfect, basically. But then a few days later, and mind you, we're just 2 weeks in now, the X-axis started screeching again. This time the bearings were out of question. The Egos bearings will not grind. At least not with a screeching sound. The idler bearing was grinding. And I loosened the X-axis by another tooth, but this created slack in the belt, so overtensioning couldn't be the culprit here. The bearing was just bad, like the linear one. I bought a new bearing and replaced it, which took a lot more force to get it out of the idler than I expected, by the way. And everything was back to perfect. So the next issue that came up only got noticed because at that time I started to tinker around with having the printers more silent. And I replaced my hot end fan with the Noctua one, the A4X10FLX to be specific. And this did not have enough cooling power to keep the printer from clocking. So, as someone who never takes the easy route first, replacing to a bigger fan like my current A4X20FLX, which still is silent, I went towards replacing the heat brake with one that is made from titanium, less heat transfer, less to cool, less issues. But to replace this, I needed to disassemble the hot end, and it was impossible to get the heater cartridge out of there. The screw did not move. Not even the tiniest bit. It was still firmly welded into the heater block. And yes, I really tried. After the hex nut slipped, I switched to a special screw extractor bit, but managed to rip off the screw head only using that. And the rest of the screw was still in, so nice. It works. It's still in there, it's still working now, but I'm not happy with this, obviously. It just feels like quality assurance is non-existent by this point. And this was closely followed by my first print with PET. And oh heck yes, a new problem comes up. Thermal rundown issues on the print bed. What the serious F. The heating was fine until a few moments after the cooling fan spun up, so the temperature of the print bed dropped, the heater freaked out and the printer shut down. I mean, I'm glad that it recognizes something possibly being wrong, but yeah, the print bed really needs to be isolated to print smaller parts in PETG, anywhere near the center of the build plate. I did that with Aerogel in the meantime, if you wonder. And with the isolation or not printing in the center, everything is perfect. And it was working. Everything was working for a whole 20 days. 33 days into having the Prusa, the Pinda cable broke. And the printer would fail pre-print calibration. I messaged support and got the possibility to buy a new Pinda. Aside from that, I obviously replaced the cables on the old one with proper flexible silicon cables, so the new one is just a spare unit now. But this already left me quite sour. Having to buy the first replacement part a month in already is harsh. And now my current issue is the X-axis idler part has cracked. I really would have expected a much better layer adhesion and print quality from the Prusa parts. This is where I no longer feel confident in form follows function, when the function of the parts is obviously not that great either. Having rough prints with a 0.3mm layer high or whatever this is okay, I guess. But the amount of under extrusion lines, elephant footing and overall print issues on the Prusa parts really makes me wonder why there are not a lot more reports of really broken machines where nothing really works due to the parts malfunctioning. And that's it. That's 2 months of Prusa issues. It's still way better than like the Chinese machines that I had where you could easily electrocute yourself. But it still is not what I would have expected, actually. For everyone looking into buying a Prusa, I hope this gives you a rough overview of what maybe to expect. I guess not everyone will have these issues. I have modified a lot of the stuff on the printer, but at least be prepared. The Prusa is not one of the push button solutions. But to be honest, nothing in 3D printing really is push button at the moment. There are a few industrial machines, and there are the machines that are in the 5K and up price point that are really easy to use and don't require much maintenance. But overall, the Prusa is a really good machine that is pretty maintenance free actually, aside from the issues.